let's have that. We've been having that for the last 2 years. We just had an entire campaign about it. And by the way, the American people agreed with me that we should reduce our deficits in a balanced way that also takes into account the need for us to grow this economy and put people back to work. And despite that conversation, and despite the election results, the position that's been taken on the part of some House Republicans is that, nope, we got to do it our way. And if we don't, we simply won't pay America's bills. Well, that can't be a position that is sustainable over time. It's not one that's good for the economy now. It's certainly not going to be the kind of precedent that I want to establish, not just for my presidency, but for future presidents. Even if it was on the other side. Democrats don't like voting for the debt ceiling when a Republican's president, and yet but you never saw a situation in which Democrats suggested somehow that we would go ahead and default if we didn't get 100% of our way. That's just not how it's supposed to work. John Carl.
Thank you, Mr. President. On the issue of guns, given how difficult it will be, some would say impossible, to get any gun control measure passed through this Congress, what are you willing or able to do using the powers of your presidency to act without Congress? And I'd also like to know, what do you make of these long lines we're seeing at gun shows and gun stores all around the country? I mean, even in Connecticut, applications for guns are up since the shooting in Newtown.
Well, my understanding is the Vice President's going to provide a range of steps that we can take to reduce gun violence. Some of them will require legislation. Some of them I can accomplish through executive action. And so I'll be reviewing those today. And as I said, I'll speak in more detail to what we're going to go ahead and propose later in the week. But I'm confident that there are some steps that we can take that don't require legislation and that are within my authority as president. And where you get a step that has the opportunity to reduce the possibility of gun violence, then I want to go ahead and take it.
Can you give me an idea of what kind of measures?
Well, I think, for example, how we are gathering data, for example, on guns that fall into the hands of criminals, and how we track that more effectively. There may be some steps that we can take administratively as opposed through legislation. As far as people lining up and purchasing more guns, I think that we've seen for some time now that those who oppose any common sense gun control or gun safety measures have a pretty effective way of ginning up fear on the part of gun owners that somehow the federal government's about to take all your guns away. And that there's probably an economic element to that. It obviously is good for business, but I think that those of us who look at this problem have repeatedly said that responsible gun owners, people who have a gun for protection, for hunting, for sportsmanship, they don't have anything to worry about. The issue here is not whether or not we believe in the Second Amendment. The issue is, are there some sensible steps that we can take to make sure that somebody like the individual in Newtown can't walk into a school and gun down a bunch of children in a shockingly rapid fashion. And surely we can do something about that. But part of the challenge that we confront is that even the slightest hint of some sensible, responsible legislation in this area fans this notion that somehow here it comes and that everybody's guns are going to be taken away. It's unfortunate, but that's the case, and If you look at over the first 4 years of my administration, we've tried to tighten up and enforce some of the laws that were already on the books. But it'd be pretty hard to argue that somehow gun owners have had their rights infringed.
So do you think this is irrational fear that's driving all these people to go and stop?
Excuse me?
Do you think this is irrational fear?
Well, as I said, I think it's a fear that's fanned by those who are worried about the possibility of any legislation getting out there. Juliana Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to come back to the debt ceiling, because in the summer of 2011, you said that you wouldn't negotiate on the debt ceiling, and you did. Last year, you said that you wouldn't extend any of the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy, and you did. So as you say now that you're not going to negotiate on the debt ceiling this year, why should House Republicans take that seriously and think that if we get to the 1 minute to midnight scenario, that you're not going to back down?
Well, first of all, Juliana, let's take the example of this year in the fiscal cliff. I didn't say that I would not have any conversations at all about extending the Bush tax cuts. What I said was we weren't going to extend Bush tax cuts for the wealthy. And we didn't. Now, you can argue that during the campaign I said I set the criteria for wealthy at 250, and we ended up being at 400. But the fact of the matter is millionaires, billionaires are paying significantly more in taxes, just as I said. So from the start, my concern was making sure that we had a tax code that was fair and that protected the middle class, and my biggest priority was making sure that middle class taxes did not go up. The difference between this year and 2011 is the fact that we've already made $1.2 trillion in cuts. And at the time, I indicated that there were cuts that we could sensibly make that would not damage our economy, would not impede growth. I said at the time, I think we should pair it up with revenue in order to have an overall balanced package. But my own budget reflected cuts in discretionary spending. My own budget reflected the cuts that needed to be made. And we've made those cuts. Now, the challenge going forward is that we've now made some big cuts. And if we're going to do further deficit reduction, the only way to do it is in a balanced and responsible way. The alternative is for us to go ahead and cut commitments that we've made on things like Medicare or Social Security or Medicaid, and for us to fundamentally change commitments that we've made to make sure that seniors don't go into poverty, or that children who are disabled are properly cared for. For us to change that contract we've made with the American people, rather than look at options like closing loopholes for corporations that they don't need, that points to a long-term trend in which we have fundamentally, I think, undermined what people expect out of this government, which is that parties sit down, they negotiate, they compromise, but they also reflect the will of the American people, that you don't have one narrow faction that is able to simply dictate 100% of what they want all the time, or otherwise threaten that we destroy the American economy. Another way of putting it is we got to break the habit of negotiating through crisis over and over again. And now is as good of a time as any at the start of my second term, because if we continue down this path, then there's really no stopping the principle. I mean, literally, even in divided government, even where we've got a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate, then a small group in the House of Representatives could simply say, every 2 months, every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, we are going to more and more change the economy in ways that we prefer, despite strong objections of Americans all across the country, or otherwise we're going to have America not pay its bills. And that is no way for us to do business. And by the way, I would make the same argument if it was a Republican president and a Republican Senate, and you had a handful of Democrats who were suggesting that we are going to hijack the process and make sure that either we get our way 100% of the time, or otherwise we are going to default on America's obligations. No, look, what I've said is that I'm happy to have a conversation about deficit reduction.
So you technically are going to negotiate?
No, Juliana, look, this is pretty straightforward. Either Congress pays its bills or it doesn't. Now, and they want to keep this responsibility, if John Boehner and Mitch McConnell think that they can come up with a plan that somehow meets their criteria that they've set for why they will, when they will raise the debt ceiling, they're free to go ahead and try. But the proposals that they've put forward in order to accomplish that, only by cutting spending, means cuts to things like Medicare and education that the American people profoundly reject. Now, if they think that they can get that through Congress, then they're free to try. But I think that a better way of doing this is to go ahead and say, we're going to pay our bills. The question now is, how do we actually get our deficit in a manageable, sustainable way? And that's a conversation I'm happy to have. All right. Matt Spitalnik.
Thank you, sir. You've spoken extensively about the debt ceiling debate, but some Republicans have further said that they're willing to allow a government shutdown to take place rather than put off deep spending cuts. Are you prepared to allow the government to grind to a halt if you disagree with the spending cut proposals that they put forth? And who do you think the American people would blame if that came to pass?
Well, ultimately, Congress makes the decisions about whether or not we spend money and whether or not we keep this government open. And if the Republicans in Congress have made a decision that they want to shut down the government in order to get their way, then they have the votes, at least in the House of Representatives, probably to do that. I think that would be a mistake. I think it'd be profoundly damaging to our economy. I think it would actually add to our deficit because it will impede growth. I think it's short-sighted. But they're elected representatives, and folks put them into those positions, and they're going to have to make a decision about that. And I suspect that the American people would blame all of Washington for not being able to get its act together. But the larger issue here has to do with what is it that we're trying to accomplish? Are we trying to reduce the deficit? Because if we're trying to reduce the deficit, then we can shape a bipartisan plan to reduce the deficit. I mean, is that really our objective? Our concern is that we're spending more than we take in, and if that's the case, then there's a way of balancing that out so that we take in more money, increasing revenue, and we reduce spending. And there's a recipe for getting that done. And in the conversation that I had with Speaker Boehner before the end of the year, we came pretty close. I mean, a few $100 billion separating us when stretched out over a 10-year period, that's not a lot. But it seems as if what's motivating and propelling at this point some of the House Republicans is more than simply deficit reduction. They have a particular vision about what government should and should not do. So they are suspicious about government's commitments, for example, to make sure that seniors have decent health care as they get older. They have suspicions about Social Security. They have suspicions about whether government should make sure that kids in poverty are getting enough to eat, or whether we should be spending money on medical research.